Hello, and welcome to the 8th Annual Flatirons Food Film Festival. My name is Laura, and I've been volunteering for the festival since its inception. I hope you enjoyed Gather. I found it to be so heartbreaking, it's so hopeful. Let's see what our panelists think. If you'd like to participate in the conversation, you can type your questions into the chat live discussion function at the bottom right of your screen where it says type your message. After this discussion, if you'd like, you can rate your favorite films, just like you would rate a restaurant by giving them 1, 2, or 3 hearts. You can do this for each film on its screening page right below the viewing window where you click to start the film. After you watch the film, the voting option shows up under the window. If you don't catch it after this discussion, you can come back to do it throughout the end of the festival. For shorts programs, you also get to vote for each film separately. Root for the films you enjoyed the most. More hearts equal more love. Now I'd like to welcome our panel for the discussion, moderator Clint Carroll, Andrea Murdoch, and Karlos Baca. Clint Carroll is an associate professor in the Department of Ethnic Studies at CU-Boulder and an executive board member of the Center for Native American and Indigenous Studies at CU-Boulder. He is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation and works with Cherokee elders and knowledge keepers to protect tribal lands and perpetuate land-based knowledge and practices in Oklahoma. Andrea Murdoch of Four Directions Cuisine is an Andean chef originally from Venezuela. As an entrepreneur, she uses food to trace her own culture while educating the public about the expansive world of indigenous food systems. The 4 main pillars of her business are sourcing locally, sourcing indigenously, education, and community work. Karlos Baca is a member of I Collective. He focuses on pre-colonial indigenous foodways, which includes cooking, seed saving, agriculture, and foraging. Now, Clint, I'd like to hand it over to you.
Hello, everyone. It's such an honor to moderate this panel of incredible Indigenous chefs whose work I greatly admire. Of course, we simply can't open up a panel on Indigenous food sovereignty and culinary resurgence without acknowledging the context under which these initiatives are being carried out. And that context, of course, is colonialism, the structure of ongoing systemic violence that continues to separate Indigenous peoples from their lands for the benefit of a nation state and society that has yet to fully reckon with this foundation of its existence. And so it's important to state that Colorado, what we now know as Colorado and its Front Range are known as home to 48 contemporary Indigenous nations. Where I live currently here in Longmont, Colorado is Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute homeland. So welcome everyone. This panel is an opportunity to hear from Indigenous chefs here in Colorado about their work in relation to the themes and stories explored through this film. Karlos and Andrea, one of the things that this film really shows is how there may be many spheres of work being done under this broad term of Indigenous resurgence. We have people sustaining gathering practices and traditional knowledge, fighting for the protection of land, and cooking and promoting Indigenous foods through the culinary arts, as well as renewing our relationships to non-human beings like the buffalo. But when we get to the bottom of it, the end of the story, as it were, they're all connected. And as Twyla in the film said, it's about reconnecting the people back to who they are. So I want to welcome you both and just say thanks for being here. And my first question, just to kind of launch into things and get you both talking, and feel free just to kind of volunteer to your insight here as you want, just kind of make this an organic conversation. But through your work as Indigenous chefs, what's your take on this? The film as a whole, but also the fact that, we've got these stories that are all connected through these common threads and are very explicitly talking about the obstacles to this work through this very, I would say, astute awareness of the colonial condition under which it occurs. So how do you relate to the people and issues in this film through your work as Indigenous chefs?
I think for me, one of the biggest obstacles or hurdles in the work that I do is the education gap, just in terms of indigeneity in general. You know, we understand our own, you know, nations, tribes, uh, you know, just our own individual, you know, cultures. And there's a lack of education just in terms of how expansive Indigenous culture really is. You know, of course, the first thing people ask me about around here is usually about fry bread. Fry bread, fry bread, fry bread. Everybody wants to know if I make it, how I make it, you know, where did it come from? Do I like it? Do I eat it? And it just, it doesn't even bother me. It just makes me laugh because at least that is a start for them. And then that's a start for the conversation. And it can be 5 minutes later, and I can go through my friends in the Pacific Northwest, my friends in Alaska, my friends in other countries, my friends on, you know, from coast to coast. And in 5 minutes, they've practically taken a world tour of Indigenous foods. And it blows their mind. They're just like, I had no idea, you know. And so even just little conversations like that, I hope that it encourages people to even just Google, you know, a couple of things. And of course there's a lot of false information out there, but at least there's a start to a conversation. And those conversations are key, but definitely the biggest obstacle is education in terms of Indigenous culture, for both people of the Indigenous culture and not of the Indigenous culture.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems like that's a lot of the work that in your positions you offer is that kind of interface between those who are, you know, and of course it overlaps, I'm sure, in the work that you're doing yourselves as community members, but being able to kind of help in the education process of just exposing people to foods beyond, as you said, fry bread as this kind of stereotypical staple. And the kind of reference point when people think about Indigenous foods, right? Karlos, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, the breadth of indigeneity and the warfare against Indigenous food systems and Indigenous peoples, you know, we have to honor that from Palestine to Rojava to the Sami people to the Aborigines, right? Like everybody's in this resurgence right now and in the midst of this revolution, I guess you would say, you know. The three stories that you come across in this movie are, you know, they're all just threads in this huge tapestry that we have. And we've been, for myself personally, over a decade, focused solely on you know, pre-colonial Indigenous foodways and our pre-colonial agricultural ways. And it's, for myself, brought me to such a depth of knowledge across this country. You know, I mean, I work all across this country, and it's absolutely amazing. So it's beautiful to see things like this coming to light.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I really like about this film is, you know, showing these stories and kind of really showing through a very personal, on a very personal level, how people are grappling with this sense of Indigenous revitalization, renewal, resurgence through food, and through things that really fundamentally connect us to one another, the sharing of food, and also, of course, that connect us, as I mentioned earlier, what Twyla was saying, you know, back to who we are as human beings, as people of a specific place and of a specific type of foods that we're interconnected with. So thinking about that, but also the film really highlights some of the obstacles to doing so, you know, in different ways. You know, we see profiles of each individual story and some of the really significant challenges that they have, the obstacles that they have to overcome. So I just wanted to ask you both, you know, what are some of these kind of day-to-day, like the everyday that you reflect on in the big context of these kind of, you know, we talk about these colonial structures. What are the day-to-day obstacles that you deal with in your work, and how do you envision, you know, moving beyond them?
Yeah, I would say, like, for myself, when we're looking at, I mean, we'll just give it for instance, right? Because, you know, like my personal story, you can say like, I founded the Taste of Native Cuisine just about 11 years ago, alongside the Southern Youth Cultural Center, a museum back home. And I say back home, it's just down the road. But in 4 years that we did programming, and that was, you know, gathering, traditional food harvesting, as far as, you know, elk, deer, bison, and bringing meals to the community along with education, was that even in that 4 year period, nobody was really there yet, right? Like, the conversations for food sovereignty weren't there. And even today, in a lot of communities I go to and work in, food sovereignty isn't even a terminology that's used, right? It's like this academic concept, when it's like the reality is like, oh yeah, you still fish, do you still hunt, like who's growing food? These are the conversations, right? Like meeting people where they're at. And you know, it's been, I think just this last year, the tribe finally brought somebody into the realm of food sovereignty, right? So something I've been working on for 11 years is just now coming, right? And so, like, time is really a huge factor, right? And I think that's something I was kind of just doing on my own, alongside with just a couple other people, was it wasn't time yet, right? Now you have this huge infrastructure of indigenous food workers, you know, and it's such more of a vibrant conversation and realization for tribes that you're just seeing people are ready. And so I think that's where we are right now.
Yeah, that kind of thinking about how things really pick up and move and have in recent times. I mean, it's just really been an amazing thing to watch. You know, I don't know, as far as when I started learning about some of the amazing work being done in the Indigenous culinary world, it wasn't that long ago, relatively speaking. And so you talk about, like, kind of witnessing this moment of a real resurgence, or as you said, a revolution in the way people are viewing indigenous foods, and that kind of occurs on this spectrum, right? Like we were talking about earlier with Andrea. You know, you mentioned this kind of educational piece, you know, really that kind of, you could talk about it as being the front lines of the educational piece of indigenous food traditions, right? Or indigenous culinary traditions, right? And then you've got the, like you were saying, Karlos, spanning all the way back to the rooted community perspective, which may not view this in terms of food sovereignty at all. I mean, one of the individuals in the film had that moment in front of the camera, like, I didn't call this food sovereignty. I just called it growing food that we've grown for generations, right? So Andrea, I just wanted to ask you, you know, how do you view this moment and your you know, your experiences in this moment, you know, thinking about how you started with this, and then what you're seeing now?
Oh man. Gosh, when I first started this, I was actually living in Wisconsin. I wasn't even in Colorado yet. And moving to Colorado was definitely one of the best moves, both for me personally, because I was getting out of a bad marriage to my first husband, and it's definitely far, far better business-wise as well. There's something that I'm really trying to work on right now is I've been I've had a seat on one of the nonprofit boards in a historically Latino and Chicano neighborhood here in Denver. And we found out there's almost 30 other nonprofits on the same road, but none of them are working together. So one of my biggest goals for my first year on this particular board is to just do like almost like guerrilla marketing, just like do outreach, like guerrilla community outreach, just walk into places and introduce myself, explain that there's, a mostly new board, a new executive director. And, these are the things that we're working toward. We are working on food sovereignty and food access. We recently got the designation that we're going to be a food distribution center, and we're in a food desert. So for our little facility to turn into a distribution center is a huge, huge win for the entire neighborhood. And the Indigenous nonprofit is just down the road from us, and that's one of the first organizations that we're reaching out to, because education is a big thing. You have folks who aren't adventurous in the Latino and Chicano communities because they like what they like and they're also comfortable with certain foods. But unfortunately, a lot of these foods are stemming from commodity foods or stemming from, the foods that other people don't want. And there's an education, gap there. Like, hey, there is a more nutritious bean, there's a more nutritious starch, there's a more nutritious, you name it. And it's accessible. A lot of these folks just don't know where to access some of these foods. And so that is a huge conversation and point of education, and just doing cooking classes, that are free, and, trying to promote those things and utilize things to really give our community, our underserved communities, the confidence and the security to know that they can start to explore their original foods, and it's okay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And that, I think, really ties into a couple of really important points with regard to the nature of this work. I read a brief article a while ago talking about, again, this flurry of activity in the Indigenous chef world. And I believe it was Chef Sean Sherman saying, this isn't a trend like, the culinary world tends to get these new up and coming trends. This is a way of life. This is really, you could describe it, and through the work that you just mentioned, Andrea, like as food activism, really extending your knowledge and your expertise into communities, and again, providing that perspective that kind of helps, reorient people's minds when it comes to their relationship to food, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm thinking about, through what you just described, Andrea, and then through the work that I know that Karlos is doing, how we might continue to create these spaces of solidarity even, how can we, as you were talking about working with underserved communities in an urban context, that extend beyond Indigenous communities, whether that be urban or rural, reservation-based. How can the sharing of food be something that fundamentally informs our movements toward social justice, toward the recognition of rights, whether that be treaty rights or human rights, or all of the above, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, food is the commonality for all of us, like we all need food to survive and to sustain ourselves. And it's one of the few common threads that every single human being has in this world. And it really is a a great non-threatening way to start these conversations with people. You know, I think a lot of people get defensive and protective, and they're like, no, this is an awkward conversation. Like, we're talking about colonialism and all these, you know, really tough subjects. But when you bring up a tough subject matter with food, all of a sudden people are focused on the food and, oh, this is tasty. Like, where did this come from? And then you can start talking about where it came from and history, and you can start talking about the things that are a little more awkward, but at least you have like a fork and knife to fidget with.
Food is the medium for the larger conversation, right?
Yeah.
Karlos, I know you're involved in, and you have been involved in some work with Bears Ears, and I'm wondering about how that, I guess you could say, not to compartmentalize, but, you know, think about that work in land protection as related to the work that you do as a chef.
Yeah, I mean, there's such. Am I on mute over here? We're good. Okay. I mean, I think that there's this conversation of, I mean, there's that perception in the American psyche of what indigeneity is, right? And you get to a place that's like Bears Ears, or here even on the, whether you're on the Front Range side or you're over here on the Western Slope in Colorado, you know, like these are entire ecosystems that have been cultivated for millennia, you know, and Bears Ears in particular is one of those that, because it has significance for, you know, 6 tribes in particular, that like, if you're in the realm of that I do with the, you know, like the gathering and traditional food propagation and harvesting, it's like a mosaic, right? And people don't see that. They don't know that, right? Like if you contemplate on the low end that there was 30 million indigenous people, or on the high end that there was 100 million people before colonization, you still have to recognize that we fed that many people, right? Right. There was nobody was hungry before capitalism, right? And it's really a fascinating, like the conversations that need to be had, even about what agriculture is. Like, what is indigenous agriculture, right? Like there's the sedentary agriculture of the Pueblos, and then there's agriculture in motion with the Utes, right? Here in this place. And so there's so many conversations, and I want to touch back to what you and Andrea were talking about a second ago, was that, you know, indigeneity it flourishes when we are unified, right? And you know, our nonprofit here, we have the Four Corners Collaborative, which was kind of born out of, we do a food and racial justice symposium here, and in all our conversations about like, what does that look like what does, I mean, anybody that's on this conversation that's ever been to anything knows, like, you get into the conversation and then you go home, right? And then you're just left with this. So we had the conversation about like, well, what are we going to do, right? And so now we have representation from Ute, Dene, Pueblos, the rural poor white, and the Mexican indigenous, right? And they sit on our board, and that like, this is where we have to be, right? Like, this is like, we have to move forward in that way right now. And luckily we had accomplished that before COVID hit, because now it's allowed us to do it not just intertribally, but interstate. Yeah.
I'm thinking about that coalitional work as you said, indigeneity thrives with unity, and some of the hardest things to get across, at least in the courses I teach, which a lot of times, specifically this semester, we're focusing on Indigenous environmental issues. So it's a class that's really dedicated to studying and thinking and reading and learning about issues like food sovereignty and the related movements or the related projects to that. But it strikes me again as, people are really wondering, how do I apply these things to my life? How do I really take the lessons that are gleaned from food sovereignty, whatever, just a fundamental relationship to food from an Indigenous perspective, and apply that. And so I wondered if you had any thoughts about, what are what does food sovereignty, if you want to call it that, but more broadly, or more specifically, actually, your work as Indigenous chefs, what does that have to say or have to teach others about being human? Back to this idea of unity, right, Karlos? And how has that come up? Aside from the questions, Andrea, that you get often about fry bread that now are like beyond the point of frustration, and you just kind of laugh about them, but you've learned to adapt and kind of use that as an entry point for teaching more broadly about what it means to be connected to food. I think that's something that U.S. society has lost in a big way.
For me, a lot of times I will talk about my foraging practices. And it's a good way to discuss food and food sovereignty, our Indigenous foods, but also just how we exist in this world, how we view humanity, and not just humanity, but all things that are living. We'll call plants plant relatives, we'll call animals animal relatives. When I go and forage, I do lay tobacco because I am on this continent, and that is what is traditionally done here. But I also bring a little bit of amaranth with me as well, because I want to leave a piece of me on land that gave to me at the same time. So I like to leave that offering, because I do appreciate that I'm on Arapaho land, on Cheyenne land, on Ute lands. And I, was born on Andean lands, and I'm here now, and I'm appreciating what I'm foraging, either for medicine or for sustenance. And I'm leaving a part of me as a thanks for receiving from Pachamama as well. So I usually discuss foraging, and also how I treat the ingredients, or how I even source ingredients for my business. And I try to tie that to humanity, just with our practices as Indigenous people.
Yeah. Karlos, you want to offer some thoughts on that?
Yeah, there's a million places you can go with that. But let me just touch back on Bears Ears real quick, because everything I do, like, I stepped out of the chef world, even the Indigenous chef world. It's been years now, right? And I don't even use the terminology anymore. So here at home, we have started a project that's fully an educational project of here with we have Fourth World Farm, and we're in a space that was completely clear cut and was also cattle land. right? Which is, so it's been totally destroyed. And so the project that we began is both bringing home the traditional foods of this place, which is great. And if nobody knows about this region, like I'm right in between Mesa Verde and the Banza, which is our northern sacred mountain right here. And you know, it's like some of the first buildings ever in this continent. This is this space, and a lot of the corns, beans, and squash and traditional foods that come from this place. So completely rebuilding an ecosystem, right? And that's something that Bears has really taught me in my time there, is how our ancestors cultivated an entire landscape to benefit the earth first, the animals second, and us thirdly, right? And that we've been using this space for we have youth groups that come through. You know, we do everything from composting workshops to plant medicine workshops to, you know, this, that, and the other. So I think that when it comes to this educational point, I think that a lot of people don't, or maybe I should say it this way, like we have to start with like, what is food apartheid, right? And like, what is it about the food system that is purposefully rigged against us, right? You know, I mean, the commodity food program was started with us when we were in Department of Defense prison camps, right? Right. And now it's in every barrio, in every hood, in every poor rural white area, right? Every poor white urban area. It's in all these spaces. And so because we've been going through it for so much longer, we have a lot more vision about how to get out of it, right? And like what it looks like. I think that we have to have so many more conversations. And then going back to the movie, right?
Yeah.
That's where we are. You know, like how do we integrate our traditional values and our traditional ways of being with this modern place?
Yeah, absolutely. It's you know, one of those things that the film for me highlights is thinking about food as fundamental, as a way of expressing relationships between us as human beings and the land, and us as human beings and each other, right? And that a lot of our foods are connected to whether that be creation stories or traditional knowledge that informs how we ought to act as human beings. And so you mentioned that Karlos's, you know, elders having emphasized and taught that according to the way that we interact with the land, there is, I wouldn't call it a hierarchy, but certainly human beings are the younger siblings on the planet. And with that, you know, comes obligations to honor and respect, but also, as you said, you know, cultivate, and in doing so, be good stewards or be good relatives to the land and the other human beings who we share this place with, right? In each of our individual homelands. And so, you know, with my work with elders and young people back home in Oklahoma, we're conducting a land education program. And one of the, you know, it's a 3-year ordeal. It's punctuated with group activities with elders who I work with, and it centers on a specific project, if you will, a specific I don't know what you'd call it, activity. It's more than an activity, of course. But all of those activities, most of those activities have had to do with food, you know. That's the central part. And that's where our people gravitate to. Like the first one that we had was on Seilu, corn, mother corn. And that was the building block for everything else on top of that. And of course, there's everything else that's connected to that. And there are kind of impromptu lessons that elders will offer, whether it has to do with plant medicine, as you were saying, Karlos, or stories relating to one another through telling a story, whether that be what we know as a traditional kind of creation story or something that happened to them when they were growing up that they feel is important to impart on younger people today. And so that to me also kind of encapsulates the beauty in a lot of your work, is thinking about how food connects us, but also how food embodies and contains so much of who we are. You mentioned agriculture. How do you define that, right? There's different ways of looking at it according to where you are on this continent, right? But I'm thinking about that in regard to, viewing this film and understanding that the struggle for these communities that we've seen profiles on fundamentally has to do with the struggle to be connected to the land. And those barriers that exist between that are what we identify as those barriers of colonialism that inhibit that connection. I wanted just to kind of offer some time or just kind of signal to the audience, since we're getting toward the end of our panel here, but if you have any questions, please write them in the chat or whatever it's called on your screen. They will be relayed to me. I'm happy to field some for our panelists. I do have a question here saying, are Native peoples, are Native Americans leading the way for everybody else? Andrea, Karlos, do you have a perspective on the leadership role of Native chefs and Native peoples, Native communities with regard to these types of issues?
I'll jump in there. Yeah, I mean, there's a fine line in the conversation, right? Because the loss of European indigeneity is so vast that, I mean, anybody can look around in the world right now and see the results of imperialism, right? And a lot of the conversations that we have relative to foodways and plantways within my circles in particular, is the Europeans' plants came with them, right? Their medicines came with them. Their plants came with them. Their trees came with them. And there's this huge opportunity right now for them to become rerouted, right? And one of the most important ways for that to happen is for them to understand their relatives again, for them to go back to being with their relatives and learning from their relatives, right? And stepping away from our plants, right? Stepping away from our foods, stepping with things, because really our bodies don't even work that way, right? Just like I'm lactose intolerant, and just like gluten kills me, and just like, you know what I mean? It's the same thing with them, right? Same thing quinoa does to them and corn does to them, right? But we're just such in this mashed up conversation that people kind of stop and like have forgotten where those lines are, right? That there's optimal ways for us to be. And so, you know, if we're gonna have the conversation about looking to the past to lead for the future, those are things that we need to look at, right? Those are the depths of conversation. I think that, I mean, I'll share some, for nobody that knows, Twyla and I are very, very close. We spend a lot of time throughout the year together. She comes up here, we go down there. But I'm gonna give you a quote from her. She says, "Harvest to heal and plant for the future." And you can look at that in a lot of different ways, right? You can say, just in the plant realm, right? Like you can look at that like harvesting and planting seeds, or you can look at that in a much broader scope, because that's what we have to do. So yeah, I mean, I hope that semi answered your question.
I agree with Karlos. That was a great answer, and I love that quote from Twyla. Where Native people are absolutely part of this revolution that we're in, and like Karlos said, like you can look around and see the results of imperialism, of capitalism, just of general broad spectrum greed. There are a lot of people who need to lead, a lot of people from various cultures. It's yeah, we need a lot of very, very diverse and versatile voices to join and to lead, for sure. It's not just one culture or one group or one anything. It's a decent percentage from all across cultures that are going to come together and help with what's happening.
Yeah, and you again thinking about how the topics in this film, and then thinking about your work individually as being a microcosm for a lot of those questions and issues that are on the global stage. Karlos mentioned imperialism, colonialism. These are the sources of a mindset that has continually etched away at the human relationship to all of that around us in an exploitative way. And so through understanding that food is a part of who we are in much more of a deeper sense than just a form of sustenance or nutrients, calories, I think has a lot to say. Back to that, the fact that this is not a trend, some new trend in the culinary arts world, that this is representative of something that has a lot more to say and has a lot more to teach with regard to how we be good relatives, good human beings. I listen a lot. I've been listening lately to the words of the late John Trudell, Lakota activist and poet and spoken word extraordinaire. And he speaks and writes a lot about things on this kind of fundamentally human level. And it's I connect that back to what elders back home are telling me. It may be, so getting back to this question from the audience, it may be that we have our own cultural knowledge, things that are specific to our people, that in many cases is guarded for a good reason because it's been exploited in the past, it's been ridiculed in the past. But if there's another layer to that, that Indigenous peoples, I think, have retained, that actually is a human thing. And others have lost sight of that through these manipulations of viewing the world through an exploitative lens. And so thinking about, again, going back to having a relationship with food in a way that honors the first foods of your peoples. Karlos, you'd mentioned kind of thinking, what are the first foods of European peoples that can spark a similar type of revolution in the way that they understand who they are fundamentally on this planet and how to be good human beings, as John Trudell would say. So I will, I don't have any other questions from the audience. And I want to kind of ask a concluding question. And it may be a little bit redundant because Karlos, you had a great quote from Twyla about planting a seed for the future. But my question to you, just to kind of conclude, is what's your take on the future of Indigenous food sovereignty? If you want to use that term, if you want to think about it in that way, or Indigenous culinary resurgence? And then what kind of advice would you have for any aspiring Indigenous chefs out there or otherwise?
Oh man, I really think that our resurgence of Indigenous foods and original foods is just going to keep gaining momentum. I think people are listening to more and more voices, you know, concerning these issues of food sovereignty, of climate change, of safe water access, food access, just all of these things that are just so important to us as human beings, regardless of what walk of life we're from. Like, we all need these things, but Native people are the ones who are doing just so much work, you know, trying to put a stop to the things that are damaging Pachamama. And you know, as a result, damaging, you know, our animal life, our plant life, and then us as humans, you know, like Karlos was saying, he's like, earth, plants and animals, humans next, you know, or humans third, and it's a chain reaction. So I think that the momentum just keeps going, honestly. And I think, you know, with more time and more information and more education, and you know, just us not letting up with our individual activist roles, more and more people will join, and we'll start to see, you know, more important changes happening. And you know, advice for any chef, but especially the young Indigenous chefs: find your balance. You know, it is such a difficult thing to do, but find your balance. For me personally, you know, part of my personal story is that I'm adopted. And so my education in Indigenous foods and culture is, it feels very disjointed for me. But the thing that keeps me going is when I connect with something, I know that I'm on the right path, because I'm feeling that almost ancestral connection. That's when I realize that I'm doing the right things. I'm on the right path. Like, I'm working with the right foods. I'm tasting the right foods. I just know that I'm on the right path when I feel it's almost like a sixth sense, and it's hard for a lot of people to understand, especially when they see me talking to the ingredients. I'm like, "What do you want to be today?" And they're like, "Did she just ask it what it wanted to be today?" But yeah, find your balance, especially if you're gonna run your own Indigenous business, because that education gap and that marketing gap, and there are just a lot of obstacles for us still, and will be for, you know, several years to come. But yeah, find your balance. There is absolutely a way to live as an Indigenous person, understanding your some of the traditions in your culture while living in a modern world, you know. And that's something that I try to really drive home when I go to, you know, Navajo Tech and any other, you know, place of learning. And I am looking at these incredibly strong and vibrant and intelligent Indigenous women and other brown women, and they're looking at me going, that's my example. Like, that's the goal. That's something that I'm striving for, because I didn't grow up with that. I didn't have a strong brown woman, or any woman in most instances, to look up to. If there was a female chef to look up to, it would, you know, she was usually a white woman. And there weren't a whole lot of POC male chefs for me to look up to either. So I take that on. I take that extremely seriously. So balance, for sure, is one of the biggest things, because there is a way to live as a traditional person in a modern world.
Awesome. Thank you, Andrea.
Yeah.
Karlos, you want to offer some thoughts there?
Yeah. I work with tons of youth. I even have an intern who uh, he's 15 and he's half Diné and half Apache. And I work with the Deep School over in Navajo, New Mexico, working on traditional food stuff with the kids. And I think that what it all comes back to really is just that connectivity. Right? We're so displaced, you know. I mean, we can have these conversations about imperialism and things, and like the concept of decolonization, right? Which has been co-opted beyond recognition anyway. But that really decolonization is something for white people to do, where re-indigenizing is something for us to do, you know. So there's these huge conversations, but when it comes to the youth and those that are coming into this space, you know, like luckily, you know, the Andreas and the Sean Shermans and, you know, Twyla's, and I mean the I Collective, I could run through a list of whatever, but you know, we've all fallen into a lot of the pitfalls, right, of coming up through this stuff. Whereas there wasn't that before us. You know, there was none of that knowledge to help us navigate the situations, and whether that be with the media or the capitalist venture or whatever it is, you know, that one of the most beautiful things that I will say about this movement is we're Indigenous, and it means you can reach out to us, and we're all here. You know, like that's the reality. I mean, I probably filled 50 to 100 questions a week from people I've never met, right? And I think that that's the beauty. One of the major beauties of this movement is that we're all here to see each other rise. So I think that that touches back to the balance that Andrea is talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a great note to end on, you know, the re-emphasis of we're here, and in terms of Indigenous peoples, it's all about the collective. You know, we support each other as individuals, of course, but that's the nature of being a community people, is understanding that what we do is for the benefit of the collective. So I want to thank you both. Stayali, Haley, Jehan, thank you so much. I've just been thrilled to be in conversation with you both, and really just to have a platform to talk about this amazing film, and of course all the related issues, the connected issues that it brings up. So Karlos, Andrea, thank you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Doc.
Well, I hope you all enjoyed the discussion. I'm really happy to hear that the time has finally come when people are beginning to become more aware of Indigenous foodways and food sovereignty. And I hope the awareness expands tremendously in the years to come, as it's apparent there's still a lot of work to be done. I'd like to thank our panel, Andrea Murdoch, Karlos Baca, and Clint Carroll. And I'd like to thank all of you, our viewers. I hope you're planning to join us for some more films. We have some very thought-provoking films, more expert panels lined up for discussions, and a trivia night on Wednesday. It's going to be a fun culinary week ahead, and today isn't over yet with First Cow at 7:30 this evening. I'll see some of you then. Take care.